Welcome back to CFO Forum Australia. I'm Amit Arora, your host. In my day job, I work with CFOs to help them find funds hidden in their cost base and unlock capital for the projects and priorities that they really care about. Today, I get to sit down with Scott Butterworth. Scott's career is anything but ordinary. He's been a partner at Boston Consulting Group, held CFO roles at Westpac, Navy, later in Gordon, and as Group CFO at Pexa. He's someone who knows what it takes to navigate the big moments in finance. And I can't wait for you to hear his perspective. Scott, welcome. It's great to have you here.
It's an absolute privilege and pleasure to be here with you today.
You've had a bit of a non-traditional path into the CFO world. You started with consulting, grew up to the role of a partner, successfully led that role, moved to executive roles. How has that shaped the way you lead?
It's a great question, Amit. As you say, I've had a very non-traditional path into the world of being a CFO. And in many ways, I think that's been helpful for the sorts of things that I've been doing over the course of my career. And in particular, I think I've benefited from the ongoing trend of CFOs becoming much more strategic in what's required of them. My BCG trading and time as a partner there certainly played into that. And then the other part, of course, of being a CFO is making sure the controllership side of things is being done properly. And one of the benefits of the career I've had is a lot of work across processes, understanding how things work, how things don't work. And that's been a natural set of skills to apply to thinking through whether the controls in the environment are working effectively or whether they need to be changed. So both of those two sets of skills, although developed in a non-traditional for a CFO setting, have actually stood me in very good stead. And then across all of that is the issue of leadership. And it's not enough just to be good technically at the job. You've got to be able to lead people and motivate and engage teams. And one of the benefits of the career I've had both at BCG and elsewhere is that I've had the opportunity to lead very diverse teams, which has certainly stretched my leadership skills and helped develop them.
One of the things that I've seen consultants struggle with is when they get into executive roles is from a seat where they were advising, analyzing, giving all the perspectives, and somebody else had to take decisions to a seat where they have to take decisions that have a real impact. That transition is sometimes not that ordinary or easy. How has that been for you?
Look, I benefited very much when I first joined the world of being an executive. I was working for a gentleman by the name of Michael Ulmer, who at the time was Group CFO of NAB and subsequently went on to have and still does have a very successful directorial career at places like Lendlease and now at Westpac. And Michael said something to me which has always stayed with me, which is if you're a general manager, you should generally manage. And you should, as an executive, be clear what you're responsible for. And if you're going to be responsible for it, you need to make decisions. You can't not do that as an executive. And that was a very good lesson to learn very early on, and certainly got me out of the mode giving helpful advice to say, I'm it.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think mentorship is really important in anyone's career, and that list coming from you, I think that's a great advice for our listeners who should take their mentors
Yeah.
seriously.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've really benefited from across my entire career, people who have seen something in me and been willing to back me. And that's both BCG, NAB, and Slater Gordon, Westpac, elsewhere as well. Pexa.
On that, walk us through the pivotal moments, like you talked about Westpac and maybe walk us through some pivotal moments that helped you break into the CFO roles at all of these major institutions. These are the iconic institutions in Australia. Walk us through how did you break into the CFO roles here?
It was, I think, this issue of people seeing something in me and also a bit of serendipity. I remember when I was at NAB, my original roles at NAB were a mix of capital management, treasury, and strategy type roles, as well as working for Michael at one stage. And that set of things came to an end. and I was wondering what I was going to do next. I remember going for a walk around NAB's building in Docklands at the time with another colleague and saying, look, Mike, I don't know what I'm going to do now. He said, you should have a think about this role. And it was CFO for what was then called Group Business Services, which was basically a new division in NAB, which had brought together all the Australian operations and technology activities. He said, oh, they're looking for a CFO. So I thought, oh, okay. Never really thought about that before. Anyway, so I thought about it for a couple of days. Thought, oh, that could actually be really interesting. And I applied for the role and I was fortunate enough to get it. And then did that role for about 2 or so years. And NAB's bank in the UK, Clydesdale Bank, a new CFO. Anyway, Gary Lennon, who I reported to at the time, said, look, this role's coming up. Would you be interested in it? Well, I said, oh, that sounds pretty good. So Gary put some guy who'd never been in charge of the P&L side, just the cost side, into Clydesdale Bank to be its CFO. And that was a very pivotal role for me. It was the first time I'd been CFO for a whole legal entity. Clydesdale had his own independent board, including local non-executive directors, had some debt securities listed on the London Stock Exchange, had a little bit of listed stuff in there as well. And probably reasonably well documented that Clydesdale in the mid-2010s had more than its fair share of issues, but economically and to do with some of the environmental issues in the UK. So I spent 3 years turning that business around, and that was a great set of lessons and learnings. And then I came back to Australia, ended up running the finance team for the Australian business, which was pretty much everything from credit cards to credit swaps. And by that point, I'd done pretty much most of the things that I could do in NAB and went over to Westpac for a short period to do some stuff at Consumer Bank, which was an interesting interlude for a whole range of different dimensions. And I got to the end of all of that. Well, I wanted to do something very purpose-led. I think both NAB and Westpac are very purpose-led businesses in their own way, but I wanted to explore something entirely different. I did a bit of consulting work between gigs for Slater and Gord, and off the back of that, I got offered the CFO role. And I'd known the CEO, John Somerville, when I'd been a client of his and when he'd been at KPMG. He knew I was looking for something and he was looking for something too. So I ended up having 3 really good years at Slater's. Very good business, great people, very purpose-led organisation, which I really enjoy. And then off the back of that, again, I'd done pretty much most of the things I could do at Slater's. And Glenn King, who was the then CEO of Pexa, whom I hadn't worked with for a very long time, but he'd known me at NAB, said, would you like to come over to run one of our businesses, which is a bit of a startup business. So I thought that'd be interesting to actually be on the business side as opposed to the finance side for a while. Did that, and then that role morphed into a bunch of other things and ended up being Group CFO, where I'm just wrapping up now at Pexa.
That's a very inspiring.
Oh, sorry. I mean, the common thread through all of that has been people have been willing to see something in me and to take a punt that actually I can deliver off the back of that.
That's a very inspiring story, and I like the position from which you're coming, and I really appreciate the curiosity that is so visible in what you're talking about your path, Scott. You've also have been looking at your LinkedIn lately, and you often talk about unwritten rules for CFOs. Can you share us an example of how those rules?
I think this is a hugely important point, Amit. I think in many ways, the CFO role from a formal perspective is relatively well described and more or less well known. And you certainly have to be good at the formal side of it. But there's a whole bunch of stuff which is never written down, and you often only find out about once you get into the role. And one of those, as a concrete example, is the relationship with the CEO. What's the nature of that relationship? How does it work for both of you? You as CFO have a role to protect shareholder capital, to make sure that's being deployed wisely. The CEO obviously has the same obligation, but you and they may have very different views of what that looks like. And how do you debate that out in a way that is supportive of the organisation as a whole, but which makes sure the best possible decision is also being made? And also in a way where you don't cause a division across the rest of the executive team. There's no rules around any of that. But if you're ineffective at that part of the job, for example, you won't be CFO for very long. And there's a range of those unwritten rules, which I'm very keen that we speak a lot more about, because I think it holds people back from either getting the roles in the first place or having achieved that, being successful.
Tell us, unpack that as for that for us and for our viewers. So, what do you do? What steps can new CFOs take to make sure that they are successful in the role, as well as the delegate balance that you're talking about between the CEO and the CFO, and making sure that you're creating that balance? What are some of the things that CFOs can do to make sure that they're there?
I think in some ways it's what you can do before you become CFO. And I think in particular, there are some relationship building skills that you need to develop. And it's far better to do that before you become CFO than try to figure that out when you get the gig. I think there's also some work to do in thinking the difference between internal relationships and external relationships. And both are necessary for the CFO gig. But let me explain. I think as CFO, you've got, from an internal perspective, relationship with the CEO, the relationship with the chair of the audit committee, the relationship with the rest of the board, including the chair, and then the relationship with your executive team colleagues, and then also clearly with your own finance team. So you need to be able to have facility in building relationships across that diverse set of groups and practice that as much as you can before you become CFO. The more you practice it beforehand, the better at it you'll be able to do when you do get the gig. And you should think about putting yourself in roles and projects that allow you to build those skills. There's also a very important external set of relationships that our CFOs need to be attentive to. Firstly, with the auditors. Now, many people work with the auditors during the course of their career, but often the nature of the relationship is different when you're working with the signing partner from the audit firm than when you're working with the team from the audit firm. And so getting some exposure to that relationship with regulators, whether that's ASIC or other regulators that might be specific to your industry, getting practice about how to deal with regulators in a way that's respectful but clear. Relationship with bankers, both in terms of the commercial bankers that you might be dealing with for balance sheet management or with investment bankers. And then also with consultants, because they can bring some very important outside perspectives that you may not get in your day-to-day work. And again, you need to be very thoughtful about how you build that external set of relationships before you become CFO, because you don't want to turn up and say, where's my external network? I don't have one. All right, I'm now 6 months or 9 months or 12 months into building it.
Yep. And that describes to me a very wide and diverse set of stakeholders that you deal with. And there might, of course, be a very different set of priorities each one of these stakeholders would have. That would lead to very different mindsets and politics. How do you deal with that? How do you succeed in an environment where there is politics of leadership coming from different stakeholders?
I think if I go back to the original sort of meaning of the word politics, it's really about a group of people working together and being able to get things done together. Over time, it's come to have a bit of a connotation of not being nice, but I prefer to think of it in its original meaning. And when you think of it in the original meaning, the question that then follows is, what is it that the other group that you're working with needs? Why do they need it? And can you see a way to say, well, actually, I can give them some or part of what it is that they need if I can flex a bit, or if I can go down the path with them a bit, or alternatively, no, that can't work. As long as you can put yourself in the shoes of the other people, firstly. I think then secondly, separating the basis for any decision from the decision itself. By that I mean, it's really important when you do have the differences of views, and you will have differences of views. If you have really smart people who are well-intentioned and you put them in the same room, it's highly unlikely they'll agree. So you should expect divergence. And you can work your way through that if you first of all agree, what are the principles we're going to work to here? It might be our principle is to satisfy this set of customers because that's the highest, the most profitable segment for us. It might be that come what may, we're always going to invest in cybersecurity because a cyber incident is just not a good day at the office, but agree the set of principles. And interestingly, I've found over my career, most people will get to yes on set of principles. Then you can go to the next stage and say, given the decision which is at hand here, how does that stack up against the principles? And here's why I think it stacks up this way, but I'm interested in hearing what you think and whether you agree or whether you have a different perspective. And then the task becomes, how do you get people back to the principle? And once you do that, and people can see that actually you're very transparent. You're not trying to play games. You're trying just to maximize the set of things that we set out to try and maximize. Or alternatively, we may agree, we get down a path and say that's no longer the set of principles we want to operate to. We want to operate with a different set of principles, which is fine. But as long as people can see you engage in that process, then most of the time I've found you can find a way through. But it requires you to be thoughtful, and it requires you often to keep your mouth shut and let people talk and let themselves come towards you rather than you trying to force your way toward.
No, I have no words. You gave us a masterclass right there. You talked about focusing on the needs of all of the stakeholders. You talked about deciding a framework of principles that matter to resolving those differences. And you talked about listening rather than just saying your thing. I think I think if you have those characteristics present, you can lead the way. You can certainly find a way through the differences. Thank you for that, Scott. I think our listeners would really appreciate that masterclass. Moving on, we'll change.
So I was just going to say, the comforting thing is it is a learned set of skills. So they are skills that probably some might say I've taken too long to learn, but certainly skills that I've learned over the course of my career. And as I've become better at them, I think I've become more effective.
That's inspiring too. Thank you, Scott. I think that's inspiring for all of us. You've said you're committed to helping leaders understand the unwritten rules that we were talking about a moment ago. Why do you think these are often misunderstood or ignored, or that people don't understand it? Do you think that's the case, or and if it is, why is it like that?
I think it's a great question. The part of people's worlds, they get busy. So CFOs spend a lot of time doing stuff, and that work is usually important or urgent or whatever it might be, but crowds out the time to talk about these things. And then I think for people who are aspiring to these sorts of roles, they often think about getting good at the formal part of it, becoming a good finance partner, becoming a good controller, understanding treasury, understanding how to put together investor materials. And those skills are certainly very important. But often I think people who are preparing for these roles focus exclusively on that formal part and never ask the question, what about all the other pieces to the puzzle? And part of that is also visibility, in fairness. A lot of the work that I'm describing happens behind closed doors or in meetings which other people are not part of. So they don't necessarily see what's going on. And then if the CFO is busy, they don't necessarily talk about it either. So you have this sort of almost a conspiracy of silence that no one's intended for it to be a conspiracy, but nonetheless it is. And I think it's a crying shame. And I think it's a crying shame on a couple of different dimensions. One is that it can stop people being successful when actually they could be very good at the role. But also, I worry that it means that only a narrow set of people get to do the role. They might have familiarity with these things because of family connections or friends of the family or serendipity in their career. And then I think that leads to a narrowing of the potential base for people who could become CFO, because people who don't have those advantages never get exposed to that line of thinking and therefore never get the chance to be successful in the role. So I think it's really important that we unpack all of these written rules and talk about them so that people get a chance to say, actually, now I know what I need to do in addition to these formal things.
Yep, I agree. And that reminds me of a very important piece of research from Fred Luthans, who talked about effective versus successful managers. Let's talk about AI. We've seen you very actively getting engaged about topics related to AI on LinkedIn. What do you see as the real opportunities for CFOs there? And what do you see as the hype,
Mm.
or what you call, and I'm using your words, corp theater?
Yep. I think another great set of questions, Evan. I think my starting point for this is this example. maybe after you've seen this podcast, go to ChatGPT or something like that and ask ChatGPT, can you build me a clone of Excel? And it will come back and will say, yes, I can. Now, it will also say it's not very good and it doesn't have all these things. You might only be able to use it in a web browser, but it can build it, and it can build it in less than 10 minutes. So then you go, that's really interesting because Excel's been around for 20, 25 years, but someone can come along who doesn't know the first thing about cutting a piece of code, can build something which, and let's be frank, a lot of people outside of finance just use Excel as a fancy table formatting tool, which will format tables perfectly well. And so you go, that's very profound for a lot of businesses because cost structures collapse, inbuilt advantages from having a platform go away, and what's left. So I think that's a very fascinating set of questions for any business to grapple with. And I think CFOs really need to be at the heart of that because responding to that set of questions about what is the basis of competition going to be in our industry, how are customer demands going to change, what are we going to do to satisfy those changes in conditions and changes in customer needs. That's a set of things CFOs should be part of because it involves a disposition of capital and resources. What I object to in a lot of instances is, as you say, corporate theatre. So, as example, thousands of pilots. A recent study from MIT suggested that 95% of pilots will never succeed. So you just burnt thousands, millions of dollars on corporate theatre. A bunch of people felt better by doing it, but you didn't deliver anything. And in fact, you probably increased costs because your cloud computing costs are probably going to go up as a result. Also, where people, this is at least better, they use AI to make existing poor processes more efficient. That's not such a bad thing. Except that their competitors who may be completely AI native have said, actually, I'm not interested in making processes 10% better. I'm interested in blowing those processes up entirely because they compromise the customer experience and I can deliver a much better customer outcome at a much lower cost. All right, that sounds like 10x value to me rather than a 10% improvement. So businesses that focus on the 10%, I think, are missing the bigger piece of the puzzle, which is how do I 10x myself as a result of this technology? And then across all of it, I think particularly executives and directors face very significant information asymmetries because often the people coming to talk to them about the resource allocation question, be they internal teams or vendors or consultants, have a lot of knowledge and they're coming up against people who have very little typically. And that gulf can lead to very poor decision making. And so I think it's that nexus of issues that I'm trying to push into because I think the technology itself is discontinuous and can actually unlock a huge amount of value. But existing organizations are at risk of dissipating that potential prize and letting others come and take it away.
And what you describe here, Scott, it's easy for CFOs to focus on their existing problems because they're dealing with it every day. So it's easy to have a problem focused mindset where you're trying to solve something, solve a problem that you have and reset the organization for an efficiency. But what you're talking about is an opportunity that's much bigger. That the opportunity is to reimagine a completely different value proposition rather than sticking to the problems that you have right now. That's what I'm hearing from you. Would that be?
I think that's absolutely correct, Amit. Let's take, I don't know, say Salesforce. And this is not to have a go at Salesforce. They have a good product and lots of really great people working. But the gross margin for Salesforce is in the order of 84%. It's pretty hard to give that up. As a CFO, I'll be sitting there going, gosh, I've got 84% gross margin over here. And you're coming to tell me that this is a project which is probably not going to make any money for 3 years. Gosh, that's hard. I've got investors, I've got board. How do I navigate that through? The easier thing is to say, let's not worry about that just now. So I get it. It is really hard. But I think it's also not doing the organization any favors because if you put the decision off for 3 years for your successor, that may be too late. Your competitive position may have eroded. And there is the famous quote, I think, by Hemingway, which is along the lines of, how do you know when you've gone bankrupt? So slowly at first and then all of a sudden. And I think some of the movements from a competitive point of view for AI are going to be like that. And so you don't want to be one of these organizations which wakes up in 3 years' time saying, God, Someone who can make Excel in 10 minutes using no code has come and blown up a business. So you've got to face into it now, whilst you still have advantages. And incumbents have a lot of advantages. They have cash for a start. Never underestimate that. They have brands. That's really important. They have distribution channels, which are very effective. So you've got a lot of inbuilt resources, which you should be able to make use of so you can navigate through all of this. But the worst thing is to be someone like Nokia who's spending all their time trying to figure out how to make Symbian work for them and completely miss the move to iPhone. And then 3 years later, they're no.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great point. It's possible to get lost. There is a lot of hype too. Like with any technology, there is that Gartner's
Yeah.
hype curve, right? It's easy to get lost in the hype. How do you recommend CFOs work with AI, think through AI opportunities in a disciplined,
Yeah.
value creating way instead of chasing shiny objects?
I call it the tool fetish. People say, oh, there's a tool. I just have to get the right tool and solve everything for me. By and large, life doesn't work that way. And certainly doesn't work that way in business. I think there's two sets of things you can do as a CFO or as indeed an executive or leader more generally. The first is scale. Nothing more, nothing less. And once you understand that, you actually understand a lot of the other things that follow about the nature of the data that you can use, the nature of the algorithms, actually the infrastructure, the sort of choices that sit around each of those components. But it's not intelligence. So once you understand that, you can then start making some decent decisions. So when someone comes along and says, oh, the model can do this and this, you say, okay, how was the model trained? It was trained on this set of data. Okay, you're trying to use it for this purpose. How's that going to work? But unless you do that base understanding about what it is, you actually can't have that conversation. You go, oh, that's probably true. I think the second thing you can do is use them yourself. And I've certainly found, as I've used the different tools, my own productivity and efficiency has improved dramatically. Not because I've outsourced the thinking. I've outsourced all the stuff that gets in the way of thinking. And so you can do a whole bunch of stuff around research or routine tasks much faster than I can do. And frankly, that's not where I'm going to add value anyway. Where I'm going to add value is thinking the subject through, what are the implications, what are the unexpected connections. And so you get freed up to do that. But I think once you use the tools, you get a much more visceral sense of what they can and they can't do and how they're developing. And then you can start qualifying sorts of opportunities that come across the desk. That one's probably worth doing. That one's probably not. And as it turns out, that's quite shouldn't.
I think that's great advice. I think freeing up.
Sorry.
That's great advice, Scott. Thank you. I think what you're saying is freeing up time to really spend quality time thinking about it, spending time to learning about it, and having that critical thinking of how you're going to create value out of the AI opportunities. Those are the things that CFOs can do to lead the way in implementing AI in their organizations. You've been through multiple transformations and disruptions across multiple industries, as with your experience with BCG, banking, Pexa. How do you balance ambition with the discipline that is needed, the execution discipline that is needed to be successful?
Gosh, that's another great question. I think certainly as I've gone on in my career, I've got better at balancing those things. My bias is always to be bold, at least in the ambition, because I think in general, if you're bold, organizations and people will work their way towards that. Equally, if you're not bold and not ambitious, people will work their way to that as well. So you go, all right, may as well be bold because at least we're more likely to get a better outcome out of that. But then I think alongside the boldness, you need to have a sense of reality. You can't turn most organizations, unless they're very small, pivot them 180 degrees overnight. You can't change systems and processes at the flick of a switch. Just because something's on a PowerPoint slide doesn't make it. So you need to be realistic about the ability of organizations and of people to absorb change and to make the progress that you would like. And it's trying to balance those two things up. And there's no formula for it. In some instances, in exactly the same organization, you'll be able to move very fast. And it's again, in the same organization on a different issue, you may not be able to move very fast at all. And you've got to have the wisdom to say, right, I'm ambitious, but how fast can the organization move towards that ambition? And if it's not going to be fast enough because you think there's competitive or strategic reason why you do need to move fast, You then need to think about how you're going to supplement the organization to be able to do that. But there's no magic formula.
Okay, so let's change gears, Scott. With all of the AI data, the new technology that is coming in, and all of the changes in the industries, how do you the role of the CFO evolve in the next decade, next few years, next decade, especially given technology and changing expectations from the boards, from shareholders, and other stakeholders?
There's been a very significant evolution already of CFO roles in the last 20 years. If I think back 20 years ago, CFOs were often seen as a super chartered accountant. And I think that set of skills certainly continues to be important, but alongside it has been added other roles: strategy, risk, procurement, property, a range of other functional areas. And also, going back to our earlier conversation, a set of informal but equally important roles: capital allocator, counterparts of the CEO, a bridge to market for the organisation. I think that trend will continue. CFOs will still be responsible for the numbers, and they'll still be responsible for making sure the books of record are true and fair. And I don't see that changing, and I think that is appropriate. What will change is the level of time that everyone in finance will need to spend on getting the books and records to that state, and also the reporting activities that also currently consume a lot of finance time. I think that falls away. Where people will be looking to from finance and from CFOs is, how do I navigate? I'm going to have uncertainty in the environment, whether it's because of technology, whether it's because of geopolitics, whether it's because of the economy. So how do I navigate all of that? And how do I make good choices to allocate resources and capital to move through that environment? And that will be, I think, the single most important contribution that CFOs can make. And the role will, I think, continue to evolve to give effect to that requirement. For myself, I'm not necessarily a finance person. I'm a business person who happens to do finance. And I think that's an important distinction. I'm a business person first. I happen to bring a set of disciplines from finance, which I think are very important and useful. But I'm not a finance person who happens to do business. I'm the other way around. I think the CFO role will continue to evolve in that direction.
I hear you, Scott. I've heard that from other CFOs as well, but I think you make it crystal clear that CFO's role is a business role rather than just a finance role.
Yes, absolutely.
So the unwritten rules that you talked about a moment ago, do you think they'll become more important as we go as these expectations change?
Yes, I think they do, actually. A lot of those rules relate to the nature of the relationships that you have and need to influence. And in times of uncertainty, because you can't plan for everything, a lot of what needs to be done is actually to work things through on the basis of relationship, because you can't say, I'm going to go from A to Z and I'm going to go via N, because who knows. What you can do is say, I'll plan out the next step, but beyond that, there's a whole range of different possibilities. And the only way I can actually sensibly navigate that range of possibilities is through talking with other people and influencing other people and coming to a good answer as best we can. But that's all about relationships. And so I think the importance of those unwritten rules will increase rather than diminish as a result of the environment which we'll find ourselves in.
So help me understand this. You talked about CFO role as a business role who does finance too. The CFO of the future, do you think that's more of a strategist, technologist? And you talked about all of these relationships, unwritten, or is he more of a people leader? Is he more of a people's person? What does the future?
Wow, that's another great question. In many ways, the CFO is in many ways a generalist. Yes, that they have a particular spike on finance, but for the rest of it, they need to understand technology, or at least the possibilities of technology. They need to understand markets. They need to understand customers. They need to understand the basis of advantage in their sector. They need to understand how things might change in their sector as a result of external events, whether that's politics or economy or whatever it might be. Those are the skills of a generalist. And I think what good CFOs in the future will be able to do is to apply themselves effectively to be a generalist whilst maintaining that spike on financial control and financial matters, but being able to say, actually, I can get across the other parts of the business in a way that at least I can ask sensible questions and make a sensible contribution to the debate about what we should do as a company. That's a very different training than many finance people have during the course of their careers. They're trained initially to learn how to do debits and credits, very useful skill as it turns out. But then they're taught how to run a set of accounts and to do finance partnering and to do controllership type activities. So they tend to be narrowly focused as they go up their career until they get to the point of being a CFO. So maybe you need to understand technology, you need to understand customers, so on and so forth. You go, gosh, I've just spent 15 years or whatever it might be learning how to be a really good specialist. Now I have to be a generalist. How do I do that?
And that already sounds like a mammoth task. So if you were to simplify it for the budding leaders out there, what do you think for somebody who's entering finance or finance leadership, what would you say is the single most important skill to build that they should focus on for the future CFO role?
I'll say there's two. So I'll cheat a little bit. The first is curiosity. Be curious about the world that's around you. I once heard a piece of advice on a management course that NAB sent us on. And I think it's a very good piece of advice, actually. The person taking this particular session said, look, grab one of the decent newspapers, so Financial Review or Sydney Morning Herald or whatever it is that you read regularly. Take one story out of that paper for the day and say, what are the implications of that for our business? Why might that be? Now, it could be a story that has nothing to do with your business, but you might say, do the thought experiment. How could it be relevant? And what would the implications of that be? Now, if you do that once a day, that's 5 times a week. Certainly you've done that a couple of hundred times a year. By the time you get to the end of the year, you're going to be a lot better at it at the end of the year than you are at the start. And it's this ability to be curious and then to apply that curiosity in a structured way, which I think is a really important skill for a CFO. And you also learn as you do that, some things are not worth spending a lot of time on and some things are actually worth spending a lot of time on. So you get a bit of a sense of how to distinguish between the important and the unimportant. I think the second skill is this skill of forming relationships with people and understanding how can you work from a position of empathy to influence the path for people, and also having the humility to say, actually, just because I want to go down this path because I think it's right, having the humility to say, actually, mate, to learn that maybe no, that's not the right path because there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's not really very sensible, and being willing to give your position up and to change your view. I think if you can get those two sets of skills of curiosity and relationship forming right and practice those well before you become a CFO, you'll be a very successful CFO when you get to the role.
I'm all inspired. I think that's again a masterclass right there. Thank you for sharing that, Scott. What excites you most about the future of finance leadership?
Look, I think one of the great privileges of being CFO is you're right at the center of all the big corporate decisions. So we're going to buy this business, we're going to sell this business, and we're going to invest in this activity or disinvest in it, and we're going to do more of this or less of that. That's an immense privilege because you get the chance to influence and direct the corporation, and that comes with it a whole bunch of people who work for that corporation, a whole bunch of people, customers that the corporation serves, and then a broader set of stakeholders around that. And that's one of the reasons why I very much like doing the CFO role. And I think if the trends that I described earlier continue, then that will be an ever increasing part of the role. And I think very enjoyable part of the role for most people in finance. I think the other thing which I find exciting is the continued ability for finance people to apply technology to their own roles. Now, we've already seen very significant application of technology in finance over the last 20 years, but I think we haven't seen anything yet. If I took a finance person, say from 20 years ago, and showed them the sorts of things we can do now, yes, we can probably do them faster. Yes, they'll look better, but fundamentally, 20 years ago, I had a reporting tool. I've got a reporting tool now. Yes, the one we have today might be cheaper and so on, but fundamentally, it does the same thing. So we haven't seen huge amounts of evolution, I think, yet. I'm excited by the possibilities of AI as to how that might change the nature of what we do in finance. And in particular, I think what a lot of finance tools and technologies suffer from is data and deficiencies in data. But AI tools can overcome a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of it. And that actually opens up many more possibilities as to how we might use technology in our daily work. And then I'm excited by the possibility of freeing people up from that work. I don't think I've ever yet met a finance person who said, I'm really excited about doing the next report. I've met lots of finance people who said, I'm excited about helping the business solve a problem, or I've got this problem in the controls that I need to really dig into. Yes, I see people excited by that, but I don't see people excited by doing the next reports. Taking that away from folks and giving them more time to do the things that are both important and exciting, I think it will be a great opportunity in finance.
I would love to continue on this conversation, Scott, but unfortunately, we have limited time. I know you are a very busy person too, and you have your work to go back to. Thank you for joining us and sharing such valuable insights on the unwritten rule as being a CFO, the disciplined use of AI, the unprecedented opportunity that it presents, and the future of finance leadership. That was, ladies and gentlemen, Scott Butterworth on CFO Forum Australia, sharing the unwritten rules of being a CFO, how to cut through the hype of AI, and what the future of finance leadership looks like. I'm Amit Arora, and in my day job, I help CFOs unlock funds in their cost base to invest in what really matters. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe for more conversations with Australia's top finance leaders.